So we are recording. Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is SIG API machinery for Kubernetes open source. Today is November 16th, well, of 2022. We have a packed agenda today, so we are going to get to it right away. I will start with Daniel on the first topic.
Hi, this will be super fast. We recently noticed that there's this place in the Kubernetes repo where it tracks teams for people. And if you add your name to a particular team, it'll get auto-populated to a GitHub team. And ours is amazingly out of date. If Han has started a PR to add just a SIG API machinery members team. If you feel like a member of the SIG, please suggest yourself as an addition to that PR, and we'll do this as a big group merge instead of 1,000 little PRs. We need to maintain the other teams also at some point. But probably we'll do those more one-off and not in a giant PR. Suggest yourself to Hans PR or make other PRs, tag David and me and Fede. Yep, and that's all I had to say about that. So, and Jordan's here now, so we can continue.
Our distribution list, the email list, has over 700 people, so it's really hard to say, how.
Yeah, we'll blast an email to the list also.
Are we going to add any requirements to become a member, or is it just going to be throw your name in and we'll take everybody?
I don't know. What do you think? I was going to be pretty keep the bar pretty low for like being a member and higher for the other teams.
I don't have a particular preference. Just you picture yourself sending it out to the list. And the first question from the list is, well, can I do it?
I'd probably say something like if you've ever done anything for the SIG or think you might do something for the SIG in the future, then consider dropping yourself in this list.
I assume you at least need to be an org member, right?
Yeah, I assume it works that way.
We're gonna find it. We're gonna break their automation somewhere.
So we'll send a very confusing email to the list.
Okay.
We can figure it out before we send an email. I just thought we'd start by announcing it at the SIG meeting here.
Thank you, Daniel. Awesome. Jordan, thank you for joining. You're next on our list.
All right. This will be pretty quick. This is not a new issue. It's just one that sort of hit a new milestone and seemed like a good time to actually consider maybe what we should do here. Can you open up the doc that I started, Fede? That'd be awesome. The short version is Kubernetes API types can serialize themselves to and from protobuf wire format. But they do this in weird, non-standard ways that we started for a variety of reasons, which I tried to capture in this doc. And they rely on a protobuf generator, which is now deprecated and unmaintained, which itself calls into standard protobuf libraries in non-standard unsupported ways. So it's a layer cake, 3 layers deep, where the top layer is us with our non-standard Go types, which can do proto serialization and deserialization, depending on an unmaintained deprecated middle layer, which is calling into a supported bottom layer, but in unsupported ways. So this is a sad layer cake. And so the question is, like, what should we do here? This isn't an emergency, like nothing is on fire today. Nothing's gonna block 126 release. Nothing is panicking, but this is sort of a disaster waiting to happen. Like as soon as there's a security issue or a really bad bug that like requires changes in the middle layer, those aren't gonna get fixed. Or as soon as the bottom layer makes changes to the runtime behavior that are in spec for the compatibility guarantees they provide, but break the unsupported use of the middle layer, that will be a big problem. So there's three sections to this doc. One is like history, like spelunking, like how did we end up here? What were the reasons, which still apply, which maybe don't apply anymore? If I missed things that you know about, please leave comments or make suggestions so we can like get a full picture of, what's the saying, like never tear down a fence until you know why the fence was put up in the first place. So if you have things I'm missing, please add them here. The second, I started trying to think about like whatever we replace this current mess with, what do we require from the solution? And so I sketched some things out there, but if you disagree with those, please leave comments that you disagree and why, or if there are things that you think are additional requirements that I'm missing, please leave comments. And then the last section is just sort of possible directions that I was thinking we could go. And again, like I'm sure I'm missing some if there are entire directions or specific libraries, tools that you know of. Looking for contributions there. Anyway, that's the overview, David.
Yeah, I had a question about one of the requirements.
Yeah.
Why must it work with the existing Go types? If we were to be able to generate a shim type used for serialization and deserialization, or if we had to change our type so that it was compatible with this new serialization or deserialization and have a shim type in the other direction, why would that be unacceptable?
Yeah, so I work with, I think I take a pretty liberal view of. I don't think it's feasible to expect all existing K2IO API consumers on a module version bump to deal with dramatically different Go types for the existing Go types. So like if you let proto generation, like standard proto generation, have its way, every struct field is a pointer, and like it really dramatically changes. It also would screw up the JSON serialization of our types. So I'm saying I don't think we can switch our current Go types to be standard proto-generated types. I think that would break everything built on top of existing API types. Generating prototypes separately, like, and figuring out some way to get to and from them, that seems possible. I mean, I don't know if it's possible, but
okay, so this means we have a way to convert to and from. We probably have a client library that would automatically convert to and from, but
I'm not going to specific solutions yet. I'm just saying, like, someone who would say, oh, well, can't you just make the prototypes the canonical representation of the API and regenerate all your Go types and fix up entry use and call it a day? Like, I don't think we can do that.
Okay.
The others, like, we have to be wire compatible. Like, I don't think
that I don't think is
controversial.
Yeah.
We have to coexist with the standard proto libraries, even if we don't use them. There's enough things that pull these in that I don't think we can avoid having them.
The others were all very like, you have to have it or it doesn't work. But that one about existing Go types, I would expect our wire format to be able to convert if necessary in and out.
Yeah, my guess is if you added a conversion step, you would hurt performance pretty badly. But maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it only has to exist long enough to get everyone else to switch to a new canonical type, right? Like if by having them coexist, have them coexist for a year until somebody in another year we're getting rid of the old for performance reasons.
Okay. I don't know. I need to think about that. I will try to add comments here to like clarify. I'll try to reword this to clarify that point, or you can take a stab at it.
Okay.
Anyway, I didn't really expect to have a long discussion about this topic in this meeting. I mostly wanted to surface this, explain why I was bringing this irritating issue up again, and ask for input on these 3 sections. I would probably like to maybe, do we have any more meetings between now and the end of the year, or is this the last one? One in December, maybe?
There should be one more.
Okay. Maybe we can circle back, and if there are any like open questions that would benefit from higher bandwidth discussion, we can talk about it in the December meeting. I'd like to at least have maybe some avenues to explore, or some questions that people can go off and sort of do spikes on, or experiments with, or benchmarks, or something to try to prove out or disprove some of the possibilities. Anyway, thanks, and I'm sorry for bringing this up.
Thank you, Jordan. Very good. Steve, you're next.
Thanks. Yeah, I just have a quick update on the conversation we had last time. So I was doing a survey of places where we actually find resource version being parsed. I did a pass through all the official client libraries and then all of the controller frameworks that folks have written in different languages. I found nothing. Using the code search from GitHub, I was able to find a couple parsing bits of code here and there. Most of it, I mean, I found 8 unique places. Some of them are super trivial, where like I think one of them is using it as a modification timestamp. There's one that is like just doing it in test code. There's maybe a couple of these that are actually using it as like a mutation cache, as we expected. So I guess I'm looking for feedback as to what the next step is here. I'd love to go ahead and submit PRs to all these. I think except for the 2 that are actually using it for a mutation cache, we can stop parsing altogether in these. But if this is a much longer list of people expected and we want to like reconsider whether or not this is the right approach, I'm also happy to hear that feedback.
If I can just say one thing, Clayton expects a cap before we change anything like this. He was extremely against my change, which I still believe was just documenting the current state, and wants a cap. And your changes, or your proposed change, is even larger. So I imagine he will want a cap for that also. That's all I had to say.
Understood.
This list looks tractable to me. I would say that PRs helping these areas out for cases where they don't need to parse is good in general, and is fine to open now. You said 2 that are actually parsing it and doing comparisons on them. If you want to wait for the disposition of the cap, that's fine with me. If you want to go and say, we're thinking about making it an arbitrary bit width int, that is also fine with me.
I think one of them was also using, or if I remember correctly, at least one of them was Go implementation that was using it as a mutation cache, in which case I think I might just refactor it to import the one from client Go and close over some of the details. But yeah,
that one sounds like a thing I would have written at some point. So
it does.
if I can, if you can find me and send me that to review, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah. And I guess I'll try to sync offline with Clayton. Thanks, Daniel.
But less than 10 is well within my, if we fix these up. Okay.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Steve. I don't see jfyi on the call. I ping him. So I guess we move forward. We skip the presentation unless Joe or CC thinks differently. No.
Yeah, I wasn't prepared, so
okay,
I think we should
good.
skip.
So let's go. Do we have Howard in the call?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, so why don't we go with the first of your 2 topics?
Cool. Yeah, so what this is about is exposing a way in informers to know that the event handlers have been called. So what I'm trying to look for feedback here is, 1, whether this problem is worth solving. I think it is, obviously, that's why I'm here, but want to get your feedback, and also if it is, kind of approaches to solve it. So So the general issue is that today on Informer, there's that whole has synced function. What that means is that the underlying store has all the items populated, but it doesn't mean anything about the event handlers being called. And so a lot of usages of informers are, building their own state on top of event handlers. And so they have to jump through all sorts of hoops in order to understand when that is synced. So there's plenty of examples of this in, the first party Kubernetes, tons of examples of external controllers as well. I was going through some and I even found that some of the Kubernetes built-in informers like this mutating webhook one was actually handling this wrong, because it's quite complicated to actually correctly get the semantics that I want to know when all of the initial state has gone through the event handler, which seems to be quite common. So what I'm proposing is provide some way that a user of an informer can tell that the event handler has been called for all the initial state. So it's essentially like has synced, but instead of for the underlying store, it's for the event handlers being called. So this goes into quite a bit of detail, but that is kind of the high level. I can talk a bit about some proposed solutions, but I want to pause if there's any questions.
Yeah, I have one. Given that event handlers are usually done by simply queuing something into a work queue, and then the actual processing happens by asynchronously dequeuing from a work queue, is the thing we need to know whether the event handler has been successfully called and we've queued to a work queue, or is the thing we need to know that the controller has actually handled every item that was queued to the work queue before the initial list, or when the initial list was complete?
What we do today is the first thing, and what we need to do is the second thing.
Yeah, so in our case, what we have done is that in the queue, we enqueue an item. Once we've synced, once we think we've synced, it's actually not exactly right, because of this issue. We enqueue an item on the queue that says like, this is the sync marker. Once you've processed that item, you're synced. I'm sure there's other ways to do it as well. So I think this is kind of a building block that will enable you to do the latter part as well if you're using a queue.
I will let you continue so that I can see that as well. That's not obvious, because even what you just described, when you get to the marker, that's not correct, right? If you have 5 consumers reading from a work queue and you get to the marker and the other 4 consumers are still processing, you have not actually processed every item in the list.
Yeah, that's fair. In our queue that we use, we don't have multiple workers, so that's why we use that solution. I'm sure there's a way to solve it for other queue usage.
The easy thing to do in tree is to track, like, if we get an item off the queue that is prior to the sync item, then we need to note that it's processing and not mark this as done until all such items are processing. But if your processing is to asynchronously trigger something else somewhere else, we wouldn't know when that other thing somewhere else is done. So we either need to give people a way of, or we could tell people just you have to not call done until you're actually done.
Yeah, I feel like ultimately, like, there's just these layers and layers of async processes, and if you want to know, has this really synced, you need all those layers to have a mechanism for that. This is really just about getting like the base layer that's built into client Go to have that, and then if controllers are adding more and more async layers on top, then they'll also need to add similar layers if they're interested in this.
Steve?
I guess if ultimately the author of the controller is writing the reconcile loop and knows when an individual item has been processed to whatever extent that it needs to be, would it be sufficient to expose like the set of things that came from the first list and not have to thread through every layer?
That potentially requires a manual work.
Well,
on the part of the consumer, right?
How efficient do we need it to be? This only happens on startup. So if we told somebody wait until the informer has synced, then list all the items, and then synchronously just go through one at a time or however many you want at a time until you've processed all of them, and then you're done, then the informer wouldn't need any more functions at all, and it would be a case of the controller would handle external its own has synced function.
I guess it would depend.
Yeah, I
if
think
you
this.
care
Sorry,
that,
go ahead.
like between your has synced and your full like lister backed list, if you got other events. Like I don't know how important it is to just have the contents of the first list.
I think it is relatively easy to get the work queue to report when a certain set of things is done, and not just that that set of thing has been added to the work queue. I think that's a relatively easy thing to track.
Depends on whether the goal of the person consuming this is done successfully or simply done, because done is called in both the error and the success case, and in one case we requeue and in the other case we don't, or at least that was how it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's fair. If your initial sync of an item fails, I guess. Yeah, I don't know, Jordan.
I think I agree with what John's saying about like there are different layers, and we need enough information from each layer so that the layer that's building on top of it can do sensible things. So like if an informer has synced returns true before the store actually contains all of the initially listed items, then that's a problem, right? And maybe that's all, like that level of granularity is all we need to be able to interrogate an informer of. And then like the next layer down, like a specific handler, like it would be useful for it to know, like, when have I been told all objects? And if it's doing like whatever it's doing inside its event handling, it gets kind of up to them. Like David raises good questions about like you've got success cases and failure cases and like, you know, but I think the case that we run into this a lot is like there's no error in the sync. It's just like I just need to observe stuff so I can like enforce policy. Like a controller that's going to be continuously reconciling, and it's like if it fails, it throws it back in the queue. Like maybe it doesn't care about as much about like needing to know when it's done, but like I have observed initial state. The ones
So,
that
yeah,
John went through, like the admission plugins and CRD stuff, like we care a lot about that.
a logical way to do that might be to take that sync item that we were talking about and just add to all the handlers, add an optional item that is just like on barrier or something like that. And when we see that sync item, we just call the on barrier. And when you're implementing these sets of handlers, when that function is called for the first time, that means you've seen a consistent set of objects, and you can record that if you want. David?
I would say that if we return has synced before the lister, we'll have a set of data at least as current as the first list, then that's a bug. That's what, in my mind, that's one of the things has synced should guarantee.
Yeah, I don't think that is broken. I think the problem is subsequent layers.
Subsequent
like,
layers.
right,
Okay.
like everything's made it into the store, and that's what it's telling people. But what people actually want to know is, has it made it from the store into my internal map that I'm building to keep track of all the objects?
Okay. I can see having have all handlers synced as an option, but I'm not sure that is sufficient for I have actually observed all this state, because of the way we pattern most controllers, where it is my event handler does a queue so that it returns quickly.
Right. That's why I'm wondering if the like have all handlers done a thing. Does it make sense to do that at the informer layer, or is that a per handler thing? Like as a handler, I want to know when I've observed everything.
I would have.
If I'm doing further asynchronous things, I can manage that myself.
I would expect that at the layer higher, and I think I've seen or I've written. It's been a while. When we were doing OpenShift before, we did this sort of thing a lot, where it was I need to observe the state, and then I need to list everything that actually exists once it's there, and then I need to synchronously hit it at least once to go through my list. And then if I succeed on all the things I synchronously do, then I'm now ready. And the rest happens asynchronously, and we don't care.
Yeah, so that is one of the options for like how you can mitigate this today that I listed at the top. There's a few issues with that approach. One is that you're potentially processing items multiple times, which may be expensive depending on what you're doing. But if you're not using a queue where you're just like enqueuing the name and you're actually doing specific things on updates, deletes, or adds or whatnot, and you're doing these list events, now you're getting events out of order and it's kind of totally broken. So it works decently if you're using the kind of queuing the name approach, although it is potentially wasteful if you're processing multiple items, but it's not really universal.
I think we just discovered that our watch queue does not guarantee, or our watch cache does not guarantee the order of watch events today. Did I remember reading?
Sorry,
No, what I mean though
the
is that like
the watch events are guaranteed in order. It's the catch-up events that come out in a different order than they leave etcd.
There it is.
So, yeah,
but you're not going to get like an add and update in reverse order or an update delete in reverse order. It's the synthetic, like here's all the existing things that is not ordered.
So what's the action item for the SIG, or what's the next step here? What are you hoping to get out of this?
I'm hoping at least to get an answer of yes, we should do this, or no, we shouldn't, and ideally some guidance on which way I should go about in submitting a PR, but I can also happy to discuss that offline or in the PR or whatnot.
I think synchronous is your best shot here. I guess I'll let someone comment on that first.
What do you mean synchronous?
I think that knowing what to do is best satisfied right here, then no, sorry, best satisfied right here rather than trying to go back to the channel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I was expecting the layer that would indicate whether a controller has completed its initial work to be separate, a layer on top, not contained inside the informer.
But I feel like we don't have enough information outside of the informer to make that decision. I mean, we tried to do that in other, in the higher layers, like in the mutating webhook informer, right? And we did it incorrectly. And that's something that I've seen to be very common.
So does that mean that the informer is not giving event handlers, I mean, it clearly isn't giving event handlers enough information to know when they've been called for all the initial stuff? Like, is that what you're saying, David? Like something that would plumb that information so that a handler, like an initial sync handler, could pay attention to that and then know once it had the initial set?
Yeah, if we're trying to avoid a separate list, like where a list where you go through it and then synchronously make sure you hit everything, then yes, I think if it needs to be some sort of a marker, that could be appropriate. But I think understanding whether I have inspected every item so far and I have satisfactorily dispositioned that is something that's known only to the controller, because in some cases it's okay to fail and you just need to know that your lister's right. In some cases it's not okay to fail and you need to succeed before you're finished. And I don't see any way for the informer to know that in the manner in which I see informers consumed.
Yeah, if I can jump the queue, I think what we can reasonably do is track whether we've shown every or for each handler, we can make sure that it knows when it's seen like the last item in the initial list. That's something we can do. I don't see an easy way for us to track whether that handler has done something useful with all of those notifications or not. I think if you need some stronger guarantee that you than just that we've called your handler with each of these items at least once. I think if you need a stronger guarantee than that, you can keep track of it yourself, whether you've actually succeeded on all those things that were in the initial list. Because it's easy to tell if an item is in the initial list or not, just because we haven't told you that the initial list is completed. That's my thought. Sorry, Steve. Steve, go ahead.
Oh, no worries. I guess I was just also thinking like the comment on, so David's approach of wait for has-sync, do a list manually, synchronously do all the initial stuff, and then start the asynchronous processing. So the downsides that were mentioned were, processing more than once or out of order. I feel like if you're like, there's established patterns to mitigate both of those things, right? Whether that's observed generation or just generally being level driven. And you're going to want to, utilize those patterns regardless of whether you're doing an initial sync. And so would it be sufficient to like provide a handy library to, help you with that initial list sync before starting the async?
I know at least in the cases that I know about in tree, like what you're talking about for controllers, where like I observe a thing and then I take some action, I observe a thing and take some action. Like, yes, level driven and like looking at generation, like that makes sense. For like, we're going to serve endpoints and we need to know when we've seen all the things we're supposed to be serving so we can decide whether to return like a 404 or a not ready yet to avoid data loss on people who are calling us, or a policy enforcer. Like, knowing when you have the initial set is really important, independent of like how you handle further updates and generation stuff and like retry down the road.
Gotcha. And I guess in that case, like processing your policy object into your in-memory cache would be a good, handler to put into that initial sync. But I see what you mean without having a reconcile loop on top.
Yeah, like you can be like how you're building the stuff you're observing. Like, I mean, the admission plugin stuff is actually very, very simple. Like anytime it gets an event for anything, it just lists everything and rebuilds everything, which, most clusters have small numbers of webhooks and they're slow moving. So it's generally fine. Like what your sync actually does to take updates and additions and like make that part of its active state is like, it can vary a lot. The question is like, is it, when it's starting up, is it ready? That's the question.
All right, how about I take a look at this issue and offer a suggestion offline. And obviously anyone else can do that also. Cool, we're 36 minutes in. Should we go to the next topic?
Yes, since Howard is on the spot.
Yeah, I'll be much quicker on this one. I think it's probably way too big of a topic to cover, so we'll just be brief, I think is fine. I was just curious, I've explored a bit with generics and client Go. There's kind of quite a few benefits I see, potentially higher performance, adding things like abstractions over Informer so that we can do syncing logic generically, right, instead of a lot of generated code, that type of thing. So I was just kind of wondering, like, if there was any feedback on like what this would even look like. Like obviously we're not a clean slate. So like, would this be client Go v2? Would this be kind of side-by-side implementations that you use? Some sort of wrapper, a generic wrapper around the current types, vice versa, do nothing? Like, is there any kind of guidance on like what we're looking for this?
Well, I guess at the top level, does anyone have appetite to once again expire all of our Kubernetes client code Jordan helpfully left, so we can say anything now.
I'm hoping it wouldn't be so bad. We've already done some work on the set types. So there's I'm pretty sure that merged. There's now generics set objects. Those unfortunately do require a bit of a code change to use it, but it's kind of very minor, and we left stub objects. So you're really using the generic one, even if you're calling the old functions still. So I think we can probably do that for at least some of the client code. I think my real goal with changing the client would be to reduce the amount of generated code, which I think is going to be quite possible for the individual clients, but probably not possible for the like serialization code. Go ahead, David.
I have an interest in being able to produce a client that does not have a compile time dependency on the types that it does CRUD on. If generics can get me that,
Yeah,
I
they should.
would accept a lot of destruction on the path through. Because one of the top problems I have with our client is not that it is generated in many cases and that there's a lot of code that goes in there and people have to pick their particular types. I honestly don't feel that sorry for someone who has to say, I need a pod client and not a config map client. I don't feel sorry for them. But I really do feel sorry for them that they want to use a client from 125 with a type from 126. I feel for that a lot. And so that, I think, is where my deepest interest lies. I would want to be able to have a client that I could use with heavily skewed object types that are not compiled in.
Yeah, I agree with that. That was like since forever we've planned to like split our types and mechanisms into separate repos, and it's just never happened. So this would finally get us that actually.
One of the other things I like about our current client, I actually like the structure that has an interface type that has the get, list, create, watch methods on it. In part because it makes the code read really easily, but also because it makes the fakes easy to deal with, interpret, substitute in.
So maybe the way to start here is to crowdsource a list of reasons why we're doing this, and start with the one David just mentioned. I think that would help us find volunteers if we have a clear reason and theme for why we're updating the client. Obviously, this is going to be a large amount of work, and we'll need more than one person doing this. Go ahead, Steve.
I know Jason had put a bunch of work into this, but I can't remember. Did we figure out a simple way to get expansions?
By expansions, you mean
there.
like
pod logs at the top. I don't think it's amazing, but click on
like being able to say client of type whatever and get something that has the expansions in it rather than having to generate a Sentinel object that embeds a generic client or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it might be a little early to answer that, but I agree that would affect the usability a lot. David?
I guess I'm sorry.
Oh,
I've
sorry.
poked around with generics a bunch and written some things on top of Kate's client Go, and it seems like you're either generics all the way down, or you end up having to like make the UX fairly poor with generated things.
Seems like a good thing to think about.
Should we, do you think that the Cube Builder, control and runtime people could be interested in this discussion too? Like, could we put the like this topic in their agenda? Generic has been out for more than a year, right? But we never really tackled this one until now. Okay, I will make sure that they are aware that we are discussing this.
Yeah, yeah, maybe we can collapse the layers at the same time. That would be interesting.
It'd be a nice outcome. Although I don't personally care for the case of pass in the type that you want to deserialize to. Yeah, following a client down that path would be a thing I think would be a mistake.
Sounds good. Okay, I see team ready to speak. Do we move to the next one?
Sure. Yeah, I think generics is going to take a lot more discussion over a lot of time, but I think that's enough for today.
Yep, that was good. Thanks.
Very good. Team, you're on.
Yeah, thanks. So before I jump into the specific proposal here, just a little bit of background of how I came to this. So I was debugging some specific request issues that we were seeing on GKE. And I noticed a bunch of logs in the API server logs that, was some error occurred, or, some bad state happened as a warning. And there was no context as to which request was actually triggering that error. And so it wasn't really useful. It didn't have enough context to say, like, what request. I can't remember what the specific error was. It might have been a timeout or something. And so I was thinking that if we had audit IDs attached to more of those log lines, since we already logged the audit ID as part of the HTTP log line, and then you can also get more context from the audit logs as well, that would be a pretty good, simple way of tying all of the request logs to a specific request. So that's kind of the background and the motivation for my interest here. And when I looked into what it would take to add the audit ID to all these requests, a shared logger instance that had the audit ID set on that would make that a lot simpler. So we don't have to manually add the audit ID to every log line. And it turns out there's already an effort to move Kubernetes to contextual logging, which means you have a logger instance that's attached to the context. This seems like a pretty good fit for the API server, where we've already got this request context and could add additional values that we think would make sense to log to that. So yeah, that's the background. I guess what I'm proposing, I'd be interested in picking this up in 126 and starting to work on it. It can definitely be incremental. I think the work here is, first we need to add a logger somewhere early in the request chain. But then after that, it can just be incremental efforts to move existing log lines over to structured logging when they need it, and the context logger as well. Yeah, I think there's a couple risks called out in here. I think the main one is there's some questions around performance. I am skeptical that this is going to be much of an issue, since we already grab a lot of things with some frequency off of the context. And the logger can be reused as well. It's not like we need to pull it off the context with every log line. So yeah, I'll
Steve?
pause.
I would be more than happy to help. I was actually thinking the same thing recently. One other area where it's a bit of a risk is if we pull bits of structured logging out of individual log lines and add them to the contextual logger because they're generic and we want to pass them down the stack or whatever. For users that are running the API server with the contextual logging feature flag off, we actually just lose that entirely. Since when they get their contextual logger out of the context, they get a singleton. So there might be, I don't know how much stability we guarantee on the logs coming out of the server, but that's something to think about.
Why would we let people turn it off?
I don't know. It's just something that came up, and we were doing a PR to add it to some of the other controllers, and that came up.
My concern with this is just code churn. It sounds like a large number of changes, and I've seen some PRs changing logs in other areas of the code base, and like often people are sending things that change 50 unrelated log lines and are fixing them, and like one of them actually is a breaking change, and it's just incredibly tedious and difficult to review them. So I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that, but just the amount of churn is makes me not very excited about doing something like this.
I think I might try to phrase that concern in terms of like how many. We've already reviewed one set of these. There was an effort to change all of our log lines to, was it structured logging?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Yeah. How confident are you, Tim, that this is, I don't want to say the last set, but that like we've got a good set and that this is definitely going to solve your problem, sort of thing. Like passing a logger through, you do that in Java, right? So it's not uncommon to do. Just
there is an effort to add structured logging to the Go standard library. And I think it's likely that we would eventually want to adopt that API. I think they're looking, they're using the logger interface that this is based off of as an example, but I think it's likely to deviate somewhat from that. So I guess that's a future change that we could be looking at, but I think that's also likely to be a really mechanical code refactor as opposed to the move to structured logging or contextual logging, which would be not just necessarily a like mechanical API change. To Daniel's point, definitely I agree 100%. Like this should not be something where someone just goes through and changes all 500 log lines in the API server over. That was my point about incrementing or incrementalism. Like I think these could easily be pretty small PRs that are focused changes. And ideally, I'd like to pair it with, you know, not just like if we're touching that line anyway, we should also kind of consider the other aspects of the log. Like, is this log actually useful? Is it at the right verbosity? Does it have all the context that it needs?
Yeah, that kind of consideration is the sort of thing that makes this more challenging than you'd think at first.
Mm-hmm.
Mo?
Just some like high level thoughts around this. So like in a project that I worked on a while back that depends pretty heavily on the Kubernetes code base, not necessarily KK itself, but a bunch of stuff out of staging. It's like really difficult if like you're not familiar with Kubernetes like log conventions and log levels and stuff to like come up with something sane that, you know, is basically logging the right stuff at the right layer and actually using structured logging and whatever else. So like one of the things I eventually ended up doing was defining a much more like developer friendly interface. Like I want this to be a debug log, which is like log level 4, but I don't need to know that. So like just some considerations there. Like I think at a bare minimum, I would ask that you build this stuff off of interfaces so that it can be swapped out under like at least bits of it can be swapped out if you want to, like, you know, if you're wiring up the code yourself in some other project that's consuming this. It's so not everyone cares to necessarily make like test assertions against log lines, but sometimes you care about a particular log line having some context that is really important, like it's actually part of your like API that log is emitted. That's some, yeah, I mean, we have a KEP, Daniel, you're looking at me, but the KMS KEP says that we will log a particular thing to make sure you can trace it all the way back to your key vault. It's kind of hard to make that assertion if you can't write a test that says that you're going to lock that UID for the person, right? So maybe a weird case, but yeah, it can be valuable in some certain situations.
Steve?
I guess I think because this is using the logger interface, there's certainly some very opinionated decisions in the interface, but it's pluggable and you can put whatever sync you want. And critically, it's not a package global, like, you know, one logging framework, we all know. So I think this would actually make your life much easier. No.
All right.
Tim, were you hoping for a decision here, or what? Were you just informational?
No, I guess I would like to tackle this in 126. So I guess the question is, like, what are the next steps? What evidence do you need to see that this would be useful? What, you know, is this something that we want to tackle on a PR by PR basis, or
can
would
I
you
try
like to see a stronger case for it? Or
I'm gonna try to phrase my thought on it, and it's not judgmental against what you're doing, it's more judgmental on me. If this appeared in the code base and was zero cost to me in terms of reviewing or approving, I don't care, Tim. You do good things, and I think you would do a good thing with this, and that would make me happy. Daniel, do you fall into it similarly?
I feel like there's a but coming after what you just said, and I agree with both clauses.
Don't want to do it now. Like, you think about things I'd be willing to do, though. Like, if this was important to Tim and he was personally gonna review them all, and he limited PRs to just changing these logging bits, and said in each of the PRs, I've reviewed this one, it does nothing but logging, and you need to look at these 4. And I look at those 4 and I'm happy with it and I approve. Or you don't need to look at any and I just approve. I could probably live with a flow like that, but going through another, I mean, there must have been 20 of those last time, right, Daniel? And they were big.
Wouldn't the strawman PRs here just be, it would consist of 2 things, right? Like adding a context to a parameter list if one didn't exist. And then instead of using the package global from klog, using this helper function to get a logger instance and then call it. So I think if the only thing that's in bounds is actually moving to a contextual logging thing, the risk is smaller than what would have been from the structured logging thing. And then like pulling context up the stack to deduplicate it or add stuff can happen later in more targeted PRs.
Yeah, so I think I might agree with that. If you can make this, like if you can do this in like 2 steps, where one is like literally zero change in the log messages themselves. It's just you call a logger that you get from the context instead of the global logger. Like that sounds easy to review, but I need like byte for byte compatibility in the log messages, because changing the log messages sounds like a really tough thing to review, because bits and pieces are now going to come from different places in the stack, and it's going to be really hard to figure out what a log message is actually going to say. Is my expectation. So yeah, I kind of feel like David in that if I woke up tomorrow and the code base was all fixed up, that'd be great. But if I'm going to have to review a bunch of complicated log changes with different, like the pieces of the log message coming from different places in the code base, that doesn't sound like very much fun at all. Okay, sorry, Mo and then Tim.
All I was gonna say is, I guess I haven't seen what the proposed changes in this contextual logging kept are, like at the code level. Like, I mean, could we do something like what we did with client Go, where we did a bunch of mechanical changes first to wire up just context as like the first param? Like if you did that to klog and wired up a context to all of its functions as the first param, and you just did a completely manual change of putting a context there, and just the only thing you change inside of klog is if you get past in the nil context, you just panic, saying like, no, you're not allowed to call this stuff without actually passing a real context.
The code changes are in this proposal if we scroll down just a bit.
Also, the klog changes are already merged. This is not talking about changing klog.
Does klog take a context as a first param?
Whoever's sharing, could you scroll down just a little bit to the proposed diff? We were looking at it earlier. Yeah, right there. So that is the extent of the change.
Can I jump in here to respond to
Sorry, Tim.
Daniel? I think we could do this in a really mechanical way. Context is already plumbed through most of the API server request path, and I think we could just, for 126, I'd be totally happy to say we're not going to plumb context through in additional places for this, but just changing log lines where we have context would be feasible. In terms of the structured logging piece, the contextual logger is only a structured interface, so it doesn't support the info F format. We could just say, pass in a single message that's format.sprintf, and not actually change the log message. That does get logged in the actual output slightly differently. It's wrapped in quotes, but that's the only difference there. And then as for moving things to other parts of the code base, I think the contextual logger with values should be extremely limited. I would say I can't actually think of an example other than the audit ID of something that we would want to attach to the contextual logger.
Yeah, we're over time. I think we should wrap it up. Sounds like David has to go. I have to go too. Seems like we should resume on this topic next time. Okay. Sorry.
It's all good. We also have for next time the presentation from Jared. Thank you everybody for attending. I will upload this recording later in the day and share with all of you. Have a super good rest of the Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Bye.